For our final keynote session, please welcome our social commerce power panel, including the head of commerce from Facebook, Mary Koo, the head of business development from Pinterest, Jean Alston, the head of business development and strategic partnerships at Shopify, Brennan Lowe, the head of business development at Stripe, Cristina Cordova, and our moderator, the chief content officer from Shoptalk, Daniell Wigder.
All right, closing session of Money 2020. It's a lot of responsibility. I was joking with a couple of these guys last night that they get 1 point for humor, 2 points for controversy. So you guys help us keep track. We'll see how we do. We're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about social commerce, a $30 billion industry. But we're going to kick it off by just trying to come up with a definition of it, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So anyone want to take that? One of the easier questions we'll have this morning.
Well, I was actually looking that up as I was just coming on, and look at the Wikipedia definition. It's like social commerce is anything that involves online social media, online interaction or online media, user contribution, and I kind of looked at that and just said, that's commerce actually. Right. And I really think like the whole notion of social commerce is a little bit overused, but I think the real thing that is really maybe the right label is mobile commerce or mobile shopping, and so we spend a lot of time thinking about that aspect of it.
Okay. I think one of the things that I would add to that is when a lot of the conversation around social commerce first started, there was a lot of talk about the transaction, that end, how's that end transaction going to happen? And I think certainly that's an important part. Yeah. You want a purchase to happen at some point, but so much of social commerce I think has also developed around how do you help people discover, how do you help people through the whole process of deciding what it is they want to buy, helping them discover, decide, and then actually purchase.
Okay. Anyone disagree with what these guys said? Do you have a broader definition?
Yeah, I think so. At Shopify, I think we look at a much broader definition. I think the popular way of looking at social commerce today is through the lens of just the transaction, when in reality, social plays a much bigger role. I mean, from an e-commerce perspective, if a merchant's running their own storefront, social has largely been a source of most of their new sales. They're coming from Pinterest, they're coming from Facebook and Instagram. We've just progressed quite far down the path of technology that's allowed us to focus on a transaction, an area that was largely a pain point for a very long time. So, the spectrum of social, I think, is just bringing commerce back to what it was before, which is an interaction between two people. And that's very different than the interaction between you and a marketplace, for example. And I think that's where, the little guys and their ability to have a business and a presence to their customer is catching up.
Okay. So you guys all have pretty broad definitions of what social commerce is, saying that effectively commerce in a way. Is this going to play out in every category? Should every type of company be thinking about a social commerce strategy, or are there ones where you think it's going to have a greater impact? Is it going to be just as important to a consumer electronics or a grocery retailer as it is one that's in apparel or beauty, or the ones we think of in many cases when we think of social commerce?
Yeah, I think you have to think about where consumers are ultimately spending their time. Mm-hmm. And right now that's in a very small number of applications. Mm-hmm. So it's in Facebook, on Pinterest, and Twitter, and a number of different other applications. But it's a really small set. And if you think about a consumer's behavior, they're not going to necessarily go and download an application for every single store that they shop at, right? It just doesn't make sense. They don't have the space. And a lot of those apps, frankly, aren't necessarily the best consumer shopping experiences out there. Mm-hmm. So when I look at it, it's really about connecting that consumer to all the different products and services that they might use on a daily basis. Yeah. And if those products can be discovered through the apps that they're using, you can really create some powerful commerce experiences there.
Mm-hmm. I think, there's this notion that the first wave of e-commerce was to bring on things that were more like commodity-based, mm-hmm. and less like high consideration purchases.
Yep.
For Pinterest, a lot of the things that are on the site are really about taste and style, and so we're starting to see like more of those kind of things move on to be like purchasable online. And a great category that I think has a lot of potential is home furnishing. Things that you'd kind of want to go to the showroom and feel, but people are more comfortable and buying. And like mattresses is like an interesting example of that, where people are actually buying mattresses on mobile phones, and that's pretty fascinating. So I think more and more of things like that could potentially move online, and in particular in mobile.
And what role do you think social commerce plays then with some of those purchases? They're obviously, these big categories that, to your point, are now starting to shift online. Why are they in particular sort of more likely to be purchased through a social network or through some social channel as opposed to just through a kind of a traditional e-commerce site?
Oh, I think for us, there's a lot more technology that's available than there was before. So, before when we were working on commerce in a couple of lives, and when I was at PayPal, they didn't have a lot of different, merchants didn't have a lot of great technology, APIs. The payment system was still not that mature. And I think fast forward to today, a lot of folks are like, how do I get my stuff on mobile? I've got to develop a rich set of APIs. We've got companies like Stripe and Shopify that are enabling a lot of merchants to get online and also get on mobile. Yep. So then now we can work on merchandising and providing a really robust shopping experience. Yep. And that's kind of the role that we play. Yep. So I think, it's just, we've kind of fast forwarded to today, right. I guess.
Okay.
And I think I was just going to add onto that point. I think social plays a really important role in a lot of product segments that aren't otherwise commoditized or generally well categorized on a marketplace like Amazon, for example. Okay. So to take the example of furniture, with furniture, I'm not likely going to buy a custom couch online. It's not a purchase that I want to put my credit card in and purchase sight unseen without touching the fabric. And so I think the role that commerce plays, even though that merchant may have a dedicated website or even app that's going to show them product specs and multiple photos, I want to be able to have a conversation without necessarily having to go into the store. And so social is going to allow that conversation to start well in the pre-purchase phase without a transaction even occurring. That transaction is likely going to happen in the environment that it most makes sense, which is in the actual store. Right. But at least the research and the ability to connect with the seller is happening through these platforms.
Right.
I think for small and medium-sized businesses, what I would say is for a lot of them, they don't really have the power of marketing behind them. Yep. They're not really able to create this really strong brand. And as a result, a lot of consumers don't know about their products. And what's great about social commerce is that they can get that first kind of discovery through these other apps. And I think from a consumer's perspective, you feel much more comfortable buying through a platform like Pinterest or a platform like Facebook, because that's a brand you know and you trust. And as a result, you get, as a brand, to kind of thrive off of that environment. You get discovery, and you get to be associated with a brand that consumers trust. And as a result, you're going to see a lot more kind of small, medium-sized businesses that are new and maybe have smaller purchase sizes getting their first customers through these platforms.
I was just going to add on to that. I think it's very much about helping people through that entire purchase funnel and from that point of discovery. And so I think about, when we think about the category question, I think about what are the things that people talk about and how do they actually interact around it. On Facebook, when we think about commerce, there are groups where people are talking about like specific brands or specific products that they're really interested in, and that can serve as a jumping off point. We think about the situations where you're in a dressing room somewhere and you're taking a picture of yourself, you're taking a selfie and you send it to your friend. That's also social commerce, and all of those things actually help drive people towards that final purchase. So I think really being able to understand the kinds of categories where people do more of that, the kinds of categories where people are really passionate, I think also helps explain a little bit where social commerce might play more.
Right. Okay. And Jean, you'd mentioned before sort of technology catching up when it came to social commerce. And Mary, one of the things that we've been talking about is why it's going to succeed this time around as opposed to in previous iterations when there's, some pushback on how successful it was going to be. And we all had, conversations about how it's sort of surprising that it's only, now that Facebook has done it sort of aggressively yet again. Can you comment on kind of where we are today versus where we were a few years ago when kind of the first initiatives were rolled out?
Well, I was about to say, once again, I think it's partially because we are really looking at social commerce from a much broader lens. When we talk about we don't talk about social commerce at Facebook, frankly. In fact, we often talk about it more from a mobile commerce point of view, or just commerce as a whole. And we look at it across the spectrum. It's people who are interacting with each other to buy and sell. So we just launched a marketplace experience on Facebook. It's also people interacting with small businesses to do this. And so much has changed since some of our very initial efforts, the drive around mobile, just the level of commerce activity that happens naturally on the platform. Yep. All of those things are very different than some of the first efforts that happened at Facebook very early on.
Okay. And do you consider sort of all the different components of commerce within Facebook part of social commerce? The messenger, the ability to purchase directly from your Facebook page, the marketplaces initiatives. You guys are obviously doing a lot of different things to help drive this forward.
Yeah. And really what we're looking to do is just try to create the most seamless experience that we can for customers, depending on what specific item they're trying to purchase, what kind of purchase they're making. Yep. Each of those experiences is a little bit different. Yep. And so that's really what we're trying to drive, is how do we pull all of these experiences together to create the one experience that's most useful for the person at that point.
Okay, good. And Brennan and Cristina, you guys are both involved in helping merchants sell across a variety of different platforms. It's obviously not just social commerce. How does social commerce kind of fit into a brand's broader distributed commerce strategy? So whether that be around connected devices or marketplaces or any of these other kind of newer touch points that aren't merchants' core e-commerce or mobile site.
I think as a small business, and again, it's important to put yourself in the shoes of an entrepreneur. I mean, the customers that Shopify looks at, about 95% of them would self-identify as being a small business and an entrepreneur. And and if you've ever been an entrepreneur, or you're ever sitting on your couch watching Shark Tank Friday night, you get inspired because you're like, oh, I can pitch Mark Cuban, it's easy. The biggest challenge for you is really to get that sense of conviction that yes, you can. It's that validation that I can be an entrepreneur. And so the thing that everyone wants most is just that first sale, that sense of oh, I actually made the right decision trying to do this. And so every sale is a good sale to a small business. And as a platform, I think Stripe and Shopify share that collective role of saying, listen, small business, who are we to say that sale needs to happen on your online store or through your native app? You should be putting that product everywhere possible. And so put it onto Marketplace, put it onto Pinterest and Twitter, and frankly, put it on your friends' Twitter and Facebook and Pinterest, right? Because you need to validate that concept. So social is a huge distribution channel that doesn't come with the same traditional fees a marketplace does. And so therefore, it's low risk. It's really going to give you a lot of data to know where your customers live and who's buying, and it's going to allow you to then build your brand on top of that knowledge.
Yeah, I completely agree. From a small and medium-sized business perspective, what we're looking at is a number of merchants who are looking for that kind of first initial discovery. So how can I enable customers to find out about my product? I want to be where they are. And if that's in those apps, if that's in platforms like ShopStyle, where they're trying to discover certain new clothing products, that's where you see a lot of that initial discovery, and where a customer goes from never hearing of a brand before to actually having some brand affinity towards that merchant. What we're seeing at Stripe now, and for those who don't know, Stripe enables payments and commerce for businesses of all sizes. We're working with larger merchants like those, for example, Macy's. And Macy's is starting to think about, they're a really great brand. They don't need to worry about that. It's really about how can they discover merchants that normally wouldn't come to a store and shop at Macy's, right? So it's not trying to get that loyalist. It's really thinking about if they sell their products on ShopStyle, which they do, how can they enable a customer to make that very first purchase and then reignite that customer experience so that someone then goes back to Macy's.com and actually makes their purchases from there.
Okay. And Brennan, you mentioned the customer data and being able to better understand how consumers were shopping. I'm going to turn this around for Jean and Mary and say, how do you help your merchants understand user behavior? Because obviously there's some tension there between the merchant and the social network, both of whom want to own that customer, both of whom want information on the purchase path and the transactional data. How do you guys manage that and work together with your partners?
We obviously both, Facebook as the platform and the merchant, we obviously both have relationships with the customer. And the way that we think about it is certainly in the upfront behavior and the views that somebody may make on Facebook. We want the merchant to understand that as well. This is part of their business, and they want to be able to understand that. I think when we start heading down into the transaction, we want to give the merchant everything they need to do to fulfill that transaction, to service that transaction, to be able to, if there's an issue with the transaction, to be able to come back and do whatever it is that they need to do. And we also give the merchant the ability to get a marketing opt-in. So if the customer actually wants to continue that relationship with the merchant, they have the ability to do that. And so we're really trying to think through both customer expectations of what they would expect to be shared and make sure we fulfill that, and also making sure that the merchant has what they need to continue that relationship.
And do you have sort of a standardized solution or set of data that you share with the merchants you work with, or is it really much more kind of done on a customized or?
Well, for our shops product, there's a specific integration that happens.
Yeah, for Pinterest, I mean, we have a philosophy of just really providing the customer information to the merchant because it's really the merchant that's got to fulfill and deliver, and they need the visibility. We're a facilitator. We're just trying to take friction out of the journey. So, the details needed to fulfill, the shipping, ADI, all that stuff is the merchant's information. And we try to layer on some insights about what is happening on Pinterest with their products. And we kind of find that is the right relationship for us because I think we always kind of think of ourselves as being a great place to be a discovery layer for those merchants rather than being like the marketplace or the transaction owner.
If I can comment, I think one of the ways that social commerce started really was the discussion, or one of the ways that people start talking about social commerce was really around this notion of the transaction. And I think that a number of us really look at the transaction as just being that endpoint. And from a Facebook perspective, we definitely look at this as we want to give the merchant choice in terms of how best to fulfill that transaction. And you'll see that across a number of our products as well.
And I think there's there's also an unexplored area, and I'd say that across the board, merchants are generally, they could be more informed about the power that the social networks can layer on top of their transaction from a security standpoint. So we often think that, oh no, what if they have my data? This will suck, and I have no idea what they're going to do with it and sell it and ads and et cetera, right? So I think one thing that's really interesting, if you compare it to the traditional process of buying on a website directly from a small business, is if I know that Facebook or Pinterest has an identity on file with the person who's purchased something, I can then, not only can I tap into a notification system, but I can also then integrate data like location that will help inform me of where is that person purchasing, where were they when they purchased it, for example. Have they purchased from me before? Are they connected to folks? And so you actually benefit from a lot more of the connectivity that I just don't think is being properly articulated to merchants. And so part of the challenge, especially when you work in the small business community, is you need to make it digestible for them. You need to make it something like, hey, here's the benefit, cost benefit, and make sure they clearly understand that. That's a role that all of us take on here. And I think the more that we spend time experimenting with commerce solutions that work across platforms, the more we'll be able to tap into the benefits, not just look at it as, oh, is the cost too high?
Right. Okay. Let's pivot for just a minute and talk about kind of shifting the consumer mindset. So when many consumers started engaging with different social networks, it was not to purchase. So I feel like we've moved a little bit beyond some of those initial concerns, but there still are those who question the viability of social commerce because do I want to do it when I'm going online to communicate with friends or to share product images? Do you still see that as being one of the big hurdles we need to overcome? And if so, how do we do that?
I think from Facebook's perspective, we see a ton of this behavior happening naturally. And so, people do talk about products. People are sharing products with each other on Facebook. They're buying and selling with each other on Facebook. And so I think we've actually overcome a lot of those hurdles where people somehow view it as completely separate. Right.
Yeah, I think we see it a lot on our side as well, where you have a let's say a Facebook user who posts a photo of a bike and says, hey, I'm selling this bike, it's $100, and then the photo gets taken down, which is like actually a very different behavior from like most Facebook photos, which get added and stay in your life forever, right? So you see a lot of those experiences on platforms, and it doesn't necessarily seem like the natural way that you would interact on that platform, but buying and selling is part of your everyday life. That's something that a lot of people do, and I think you just have to make it natural, right? It's not like we're asking people to buy a product on Macy's and then like share the product with all their friends in a really unnatural way, right? It has to flow within the nature of the apps and the way that people use them. And if it does, you can create a lot of experiences that feel very native and organic.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe I'll take a different tack because I do think one of the challenges is balancing kind of that user conversation with why you came to the property. I think we kind of see some of this with Snapchat, and their struggle to balance stories and the snaps that people see with their friends. For our property, a lot of people come specifically for ideas, so that's kind of what users expect. I think you can manage it, but it just has to be carefully managed. But I think for Pinterest, many of the ideas are products, and a lot of people are going there with the intent to buy a product. So, for us, it's facilitating that along with all the other content that people are contributing to Pinterest that may not be products. So that's kind of our balancing act.
And I want to, this is another interesting point because like a lot of the technology we talk about is through the lens of what does this look like to us as people sitting in North America with technology that is largely released first into the US, that is not necessarily tapping into like the cultural phenomenon that is buying and commerce as just a human transaction. And so a very clear example of this, I was actually on, I think it was Twitter last week, and I saw that there was a Shopify merchant who was one of our merchants in the Middle East. And he had posted on Twitter that he was selling these watches, and it had a beautiful image of the watches. And then I looked and I was like, where does this thing link off to? And I clicked it, and it was actually a Google form, and it was people putting in their like name, their address, and a contact information. I think it was like a WhatsApp ID. And the purpose of that form was to facilitate a COD transaction. And so, it's like social has long been used since it had been released in its most primitive form to connect people. And with that in mind, I mean, a lot of the tools we're talking about here in North America are simplifying the journey that we expect as buyers here in North America, but that's definitely not the same internationally, and I think that's where commerce through an international lens, as it relates to the role and use of social, is actually very, very different and hugely intriguing.
Right.
Yeah, if you see services like WeChat as an example, where like there's so much native commerce that's happening within those kinds of applications, and people who are just, for example, like posting a photo and then like commenting on it, and if you comment in a certain way, that means effectively you're buying the product, which is just a very different interaction that we have here. And I think a lot of those experiences, a lot of merchants in North America haven't really tapped into, and they haven't really understood, and that's something that I think a lot of businesses can really bring to the table.
And do you see the U.S. sort of following along those lines at any point? I mean, WeChat is often touted as being probably the best example of social commerce that exists today. Do you think that something like that is going to end up playing out here? And then I guess sort of a second part of that question too is how do you drive adoption in other markets, let's say Europe or Latin America, where it hasn't taken off to the same degree that it has in the U.S. to date? So sort of two sides of the coin there.
Well, I would argue that commerce has taken, social commerce, however you'd like to define it, I think actually has taken off in a number of places outside of the US. It just takes a different form. I think to Brennan's point, what we see, for example, in Southeast Asia is there's a ton of commerce. Everyone engages in it. Everyone's a micro-entrepreneur. But because there's so many small people who are small businesses or individuals who are doing this, the way that they interact to sell is just very different. And they use on Facebook, for example, they'll use groups or they'll use profiles to kind of get the word out. And the way they close the transaction is not a Google form in this case, but often messaging or conversation. And so it's not that the commerce isn't happening, it's that how the transaction is closing may be a little bit different. And in fact, in some ways, they may be more savvy in terms of understanding how to use the distribution from a social platform than some US merchants may be.
Right. And can you talk at all about sort of what you admire about WeChat's offering? I mean, some of the things that they've done well, or Southeast Asia, you mentioned, e-commerce there was actually sort of built on the back of social commerce as opposed to the other side. What do you think are interesting about what some of those companies have done as you look forward to the future?
Well, I think what we see in Southeast Asia from smaller merchants, for example, is really just a real intensity and a desire to make their business work no matter how small it starts. And so they will use every single distribution channel that's available to them. I think Brennan at the beginning mentioned if you're a small merchant, it probably doesn't really matter to you where the sale is coming from. You just want the sale. And so we see them just using every single distribution channel on Facebook, outside of Facebook, to really make that happen. We see them getting over their logistics hurdles also in very interesting ways, right? Where who knew that you could close a transaction in Messenger, right? But that's what they've figured out how to do.
And that's actually a good segue into the question around inventory, which has been one of the big hurdles within social e-commerce, is ensuring that you're providing consumers with access to real-time inventory information, because the last thing you want is for someone to order a shirt that's out of stock because they've just sold the last one in their warehouse. Is that still a big challenge, or where are we coming with that issue?
I think it's definitely a challenge. For us, it's been about integrating into the systems that merchants already use. The unfortunate piece is that merchants don't really want to, for example, set aside inventory for a specific platform. Instead, what they would rather do is just have their existing systems, an order management system, Shopify, integrated into the way that they sell across all these platforms. And that way, at any given time, you have that real-time data. And I think it's ultimately responsible for ensuring a good customer experience at the end of the day. For us, it's been a matter of ensuring that we have really great integrations with Google Feeds and the likes of a number of other e-commerce platforms for enterprise, things like Hybris and Demandware, that really have all of that data so you can ensure a real-time experience.
Yeah, and no one wakes up and is stoked about inventory. No one's pumped to get out of bed and be like, oh, can't wait to tackle my inventory challenges today. The challenge, I think, is Amazon has set such a ridiculously high bar as it relates to consumer SLAs. So, 10 years ago, when Amazon didn't have the kind of product breadth that it does now, nor did it have the facilities and the infrastructure to get things from A to B, it was okay to wait 7 business days for my product to show up. And today, 4 business days in the U.S., you're flipping out and calling support. And so small businesses have a really big challenge in front of them, which is that if consumers who are purchasing or splitting their time across marketplaces as well as direct small businesses, SLA is starting to become very, very important. And so we talk a lot about the transaction aspect, one click, we're aspiring towards that. The fulfillment and inventory problems that you address is that product actually going to come to my house when I think it's going to come is a tall order. And so I think there's an enormous amount of opportunity. I mean, Shopify is thinking about it a lot. We can't say we've solved it because it's a problem that kind of continues to persist, but it's a phenomenal problem, which is how can we equip small businesses to operate at the same level of efficiency that an Amazon does at a fraction of the price without owning any of those warehouses. Crazy tall order, but what an exciting challenge.
Okay.
Glad you guys are working on it.
He's going to solve all your problems.
Yeah, exactly. It's really like the last mile of e-commerce, and just kind of Christina's point in China, I think the expectation is you get your stuff immediately.
Right.
If you order an outfit, someone is out there waiting for you to try it on. So if it doesn't work, you could just give it back to the delivery person. And I was kind of blown away at that story, but I think it really shows where this could go. And I think there's definitely, in order to do that kind of level of service, you really need to have sophisticated OMS.
And do you think consumers are going to have the same expectations of a purchase made through a social platform that they would through a traditional retailer's website in terms of how quickly that package is going to be delivered and the overall experience?
My side, 100%. At that point, I don't really empathize with the fact that I'm purchasing through social as an excuse for why my package didn't show up. If I'm going to spend the same amount of money I could have spent with maybe a more reliable retailer, the options for people to buy things online is so incredibly diverse today that I'm not going to sit around and wait for them to catch up that second or third time round. The exception to that, though, I would say, is if you do have a connection with the business owner. And I would say that that's going to trump, in many cases, the commoditization and the ability to get something really quickly, is if I can talk to that merchant via Messenger, and they're updating me along the process, oh, hey, there was a malfunction, my staff member miscounted inventory, I'm gonna actually have to get that to you in 2 days. That relationship will trump, I believe, what is gonna be a fairly transactional experience across many other sales channels.
Who's going to get blamed if the package doesn't arrive in time? Is it the social platform? Is it the merchant?
From what we've seen, consumers understand the separation between the social platform and the merchant. Yeah. They understand who they're purchasing from. Mm-hmm. They understand who's actually delivering the product. And so I think the question will really go back to the merchant, and in the same way, you were asking, are they going to have the same expectation as if they purchased directly from the website? I think the answer is probably yes, because they understand that they're purchasing directly from the merchant, and that it's the social platform that's actually facilitating.
Okay. Have you seen anything different or similar?
Well, I think in a world where people are selling in multiple channels, and Amazon being one of those channels, yep. You definitely think about what the bar is for that delivery. So you wouldn't want to have like shipping speeds or shipping costs that are different from the other channels. And so we try to do our best to incentivize merchants to provide their best offer. And so I do think there is a little bit of spillover. If your channel is consistently the one where you're not getting the good deal, that's going to hurt. It's going to hurt your brand.
Okay. Excellent. And I think we're just about at time at this point. So thank you to everyone for coming to Money 2020. We hope to see you back here in Vegas for Shoptalk in March. And thank you to all of our panelists as well. Great job.
Thanks.